I pulled into the parking lot of the diner on Route 9 and just sat there. The folder was on the passenger seat. I hadn't opened it yet. My grandfather had handed it to me 40 minutes ago, right there in front of the house where I grew up. And he'd said 4 words before he walked back to his car. Don't open it here. So I drove. I didn't know where I was going. I ended up at a diner I hadn't been to since high school, parked between a pickup truck and a minivan, and I sat with my hands in my lap, staring at a manila folder with my name written on it in my grandfather's handwriting. The letters were careful and deliberate, the way he wrote everything. Nora. Just my name. Nothing else. I sat there for almost an hour before I opened it. I need to back up. My mother died when I was 10 years old. Ovarian cancer. She was diagnosed in January and gone by September. And I remember thinking that summer that September was the cruelest month because nothing about it felt like an ending. The leaves hadn't even started turning yet. My father held my hand at the funeral and told me it was just the 2 of us now, but that we were going to be okay. I believed him. I was 10, and he was my father, and I had no reason not to believe him. My grandfather, my father's father, drove 8 hours from western Pennsylvania to be there. He was a quiet man who smelled like cedar and motor oil, the kind of man who showed up without being asked and left without making a fuss. At the reception, when everyone else was speaking in hushed, careful tones around me, he sat down next to me on the back porch steps and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother was a remarkable woman. Don't you ever let anyone tell you different?" I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I do now. My father remarried 2 years later. My stepmother was introduced to me on a Sunday afternoon in our living room, and she smiled the whole time and told me to call her whatever felt comfortable. I called her by her first name for about a year, before I stopped calling her anything at all. Her son, my stepbrother, moved in 3 months after the wedding. He was 13, a year older than me, and he had a way of looking at things in the house like he was already calculating what would be his. I want to be fair. I have tried, over the years, to be fair. Maybe my stepmother wasn't deliberately cruel in the beginning. Maybe she just loved her son the way a mother loves her child and didn't know how to extend that to someone else's daughter. Maybe the first time she forgot to mention me in the holiday card was an oversight. Maybe the first time she told my father I was a difficult kid when I asked why my stepbrother got a car for his 16th birthday and I got nothing was just a misunderstanding. But it kept happening. I did the dishes. My stepbrother did not. I was given a budget for school clothes that didn't cover what I actually needed. My stepbrother had a credit card. When my father's company, a mid-sized manufacturing business his own father had built, started to do well, my stepbrother was brought in for summer internships starting at 16. I was never asked. When I asked my father once if I could come in and learn, he looked at me with a kind of vague discomfort, like the question had caught him off guard, and said he'd talk to my stepmother about it. He never brought it up again. The thing about being treated as less than in your own home is that it's designed to make you doubt yourself. Every instance has an explanation. Every slight can be rationalized. I spent years constructing arguments for why things were actually fine, why I was being too sensitive, why my stepbrother simply had different needs, why my father's distance was grief he hadn't processed, and not a choice he was making. I was very good at explaining things away. I had to be. Because if I stopped explaining them away, I had to look at what was actually in front of me. What was in front of me was this. By the time I left for college, I had been removed from my own family as cleanly as if someone had taken a pair of scissors and cut around my outline. My grandfather called me every 2 weeks throughout college, every single week during finals. He asked about my classes, my friends, whether I was eating enough. He mailed birthday cards to my campus address, not to the house, never to the house, and each one had a handwritten note inside. Some were short, some were longer. They all said variations of the same thing. I see you. I am proud of you. You come from good people. In my junior year, during one of our calls, he said something that struck me as odd. He said, "Nora, I need you to do something for me. I need you to keep these cards somewhere safe. Every single one. Will you do that?" I laughed a little and said, "Of course." He didn't explain why. I put them all in a shoebox and didn't think much about it. After I graduated, I moved to a city 4 hours from home and got a job in healthcare administration. I built a life. A small one at first, then a fuller one. I had friends, a decent apartment, work I was genuinely good at. I called my father on holidays. The conversations were always polite and short, like calls between acquaintances who share a history but not a present. My stepmother was usually in the background. My stepbrother had joined the company full-time by then. I heard his name in every conversation, always attached to something. A promotion, a deal he'd closed, a conference he was attending on behalf of the company. My name was attached to nothing. I told myself I didn't care. I had built something of my own, hadn't I? I didn't need my father's company or his house or his validation. I was fine. I was not fine. I just didn't have the language for it yet. On the morning of my 28th birthday, my grandfather called before 7 a.m. He never called that early. I answered half asleep and he said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I'm about 2 hours away. I'd like to stop by and take you to breakfast if that's all right." I sat up fast. "You're driving here? From Pennsylvania?" "I've been planning this for a while," he said. "Don't make a fuss, just be ready." He arrived at 9:15 in his old dark green truck. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, a little slower getting out of the car, a little more careful on the stairs, but his eyes were exactly the same. Sharp and warm and steady. He took me to a breakfast place I liked, and we talked for almost 2 hours about everything and nothing. My job, his garden, a documentary he'd watched about migratory birds. He was unhurried, deliberate. The way he always was. When we got back to my apartment building, he reached into the back seat of his truck and brought out the folder. He held it for a moment before handing it to me. "This is yours," he said. "It's always been yours. I need you to read everything inside. And I need you to do it alone. Somewhere quiet." He paused. "And Nora, I need you to trust that everything in there is real, even when part of you wants to convince yourself it isn't." That was strange enough that I looked at him carefully. "What's in it?" He smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that knows something you don't yet. "Read it," he said, "then call me." He hugged me for a long time. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. And that's how I ended up in a parking lot on Route 9 for almost an hour before I could make myself open a folder with my own name on it. Inside were 3 things. The first was a legal document. 15 pages, dense with language, but the summary at the top was in plain English. When my grandfather founded the company 40 years ago, he had set aside a portion of ownership in a family trust. When I was born, he amended the trust to designate 35% of the company's shares, specifically to me, to be held until my 28th birthday, and then transferred entirely into my name. The document was dated 2 months after my birth. It had been reviewed, signed, and registered by a firm in Pittsburgh. My name was on it. My full legal name. Not my stepbrother's, mine. The second thing was a letter from my grandfather. 11 pages, handwritten. I will not reproduce all of it here, but I will tell you what it said in essence. He told me that he had watched, over 20 years, as my stepmother methodically worked to erase me from my father's life and from the company his own parents had sacrificed to build. He told me he had confronted my father twice and been told each time that he was misreading things, that my stepmother was a good woman, that everything was fine. He told me he had consulted with a lawyer when I was 14 about whether there was any legal action to take, and been told there was not parenting decisions were not his to make. So he had done the only thing he could do. He had made sure that when the time came, the company would have to reckon with me whether it wanted to or not. He wrote, "I waited until your 28th birthday because I needed you to be a grown woman with a life of your own before any of this landed on you. I needed you to know who you were before you found out what you were owed. If I'd told you at 18, you might have let them talk you out of it. You were too used to doubting yourself. You had to grow into the version of you that doesn't do that anymore. I hope you're her now. I believe you are." I read that paragraph 4 times. The third thing was a stack of photocopies. Letters between my grandfather and the company's legal team. Meeting minutes from the board, my grandfather had remained on the board, in which my stepmother had, on 3 separate occasions, proposed restructuring the ownership of the company in ways that would have excluded the trust designation entirely. Each time, my grandfather had blocked it. Each time, my stepmother had tabled the proposal and tried again a few years later. The most recent attempt was 18 months ago. I sat in that parking lot until the afternoon light changed. I called my grandfather from the car. He picked up on the second ring. He said, "You don't have to start anywhere today. You just have to know that it's real." Does my father know about the trust? A pause. He knew when you were born. I made sure of it. He chose not to think about it. That sentence did something to me that I'm still not entirely sure how to describe. It wasn't shock, exactly. It was more like a bruise you've been pressing on for years finally getting named. My father hadn't been kept in the dark. He had looked away. There's a difference, and knowing the difference matters. I asked my grandfather what I was supposed to do now. He said, "That's up to you. The shares are legally yours. You can engage the company's existing legal team or hire your own. You can do this quietly or not quietly at all. But Nora, you do not have to do anything you don't want to do. You don't have to fight anyone if you don't want to. You could take the shares and have no further involvement. That is also a choice." I looked at the folder on my lap. "And if I want to be involved in the company?" he said, quietly. "Then you have every right in the world." I drove home. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table and read every document in that folder twice more. Then I called a lawyer, not the company's lawyer, my own, a woman I'd been referred to by a colleague, someone with no existing relationship to anyone in my family. I told her what I had. She told me to bring everything to her office first thing Monday morning. That was a Friday. I spent that weekend in a state I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't happiness and it wasn't anger, though both were in there. It was something more like clarification, like when your eyes finally adjust to a dark room and you can see the shapes of things. The room hadn't changed. You'd just stopped being blind to it. I did not call my father that weekend. I was not ready to. I thought about what I would say, constructed conversations in my head, rehearsed versions of myself that were calm and versions that were not calm at all. I settled on nothing. I decided to wait until I had met with my lawyer and understood exactly where I stood before I said a word to anyone in that house. Monday morning arrived. I brought the folder. My lawyer reviewed everything carefully, asked me several pointed questions, and then leaned back in her chair and said, "This is airtight. The trust has been properly maintained. The documentation is complete, and your grandfather followed every correct procedure. As of your 28th birthday, these shares belong to you." She said the company's board would need to be formally notified, and that the transfer would require some administrative processing, but that there was no legal mechanism by which this could be contested. The shares were mine. She paused and said, "I do want to prepare you for the possibility that the people currently running the company's day-to-day operations may not respond well to this." I almost laughed. "I'm aware," I said. My father called me on a Wednesday evening, 2 days after the board had been formally notified. I watched his name on my phone screen for 3 rings before I answered. His voice was tightly controlled in a way that told me he was working very hard to keep it that way. He said my name. Then he said, "I think we need to talk." I said I agreed. He said, "Your grandfather did this without—" He stopped, reorganized. I wasn't aware he was planning to act on the trust at this time. "The trust has been in place since before I could walk," I said. The timing wasn't a surprise to anyone who was paying attention. Silence. He said, "I want you to understand that this puts the company in a complicated position." I said, "I want you to understand that the company being in a complicated position is not something I caused." Another silence, longer this time. Then he said quietly, "Nora, I know I haven't always." He stopped again. He seemed to be having difficulty locating the sentence. "I should have done better. I know that." It was not an apology. It was the shape of one, without the substance. But it was more than I had expected, and I wasn't sure what to do with it, so I filed it away and said nothing. He said my stepmother wanted to speak with me directly. He said it in the tone of a man who had been asked to deliver a message he did not want to deliver. I said, "That's fine. She can call me." She called the next morning. I had expected anger and instead got something more carefully packaged. Concern. She was very worried. she said, about the disruption this would cause. She was very worried about how this would affect the relationships within the family. She used the word family 6 times in the first 4 minutes of the conversation, which I know because I was counting. She said she hoped we could find a solution that worked for everyone. I let her finish. Then I said, I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You're asking me to do something about shares that have been legally mine since birth, so that the current arrangement which cut me out entirely can continue? A pause. Then, I don't think that's a fair characterization. Which part? She said she had always wanted to include me. She said she had always thought of me as family. She said my grandfather had never told anyone this was coming, and that it felt like an ambush. I said, it's not an ambush. It's a document that's been on file for 28 years. The only thing that changed is that I'm finally old enough to access what was already mine. Her tone shifted then. Just slightly. The warmth cooled. Your grandfather was always very attached to you, she said. I hope you can see that this might be about his feelings more than what's actually fair. I had been waiting for this one. The suggestion that my grandfather's love was a liability, that caring about me was suspect. I had been hearing variations of this for years. You're too sensitive, you're imagining things, you're reading too much into it, and I recognized this version immediately. I said, I have reviewed the legal documents with my own attorney. The trust is valid, and the transfer is being processed. I'm happy to be in contact through legal counsel if there are further questions. I ended the call. I won't pretend that felt as clean as it sounds. I sat on my couch afterward for a long time with my phone in my hands, working through the particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something but from finally seeing clearly what was already lost. I had not lost my stepmother's love on that phone call. I had never had it. What I lost was the last frail possibility that I had been wrong about that. There is a kind of sadness in that, even when you are also, underneath it, entirely certain you have done the right thing. My grandfather called that evening. I told him about both conversations. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, Are you okay? I said, I think I will be. He said, You know, when you were about 3 years old, you used to sit on the shop floor while I worked. You never touched anything you weren't supposed to. You just watched. Every now and then, you'd ask a question, and I'd answer it. And you'd think about it for a while before asking the next one. Your father was never like that. He had no patience for the slow part. But you always understood that the slow part was where you actually learned things. I didn't say anything. I was crying a little, which I hadn't expected. He said, That company has your grandmother's hands in it. My parents' savings. 40 years of people showing up and doing the work. It should have someone running it who understands what that means. I asked him if he thought I could do it. He said, I think you've been doing it in every other way your whole life. You just haven't had the title. The formal transfer was completed 6 weeks later. I had, by that point, told my employer I would be leaving at the end of the quarter, a conversation that was harder than I'd anticipated because I genuinely loved my job and the people and the version of myself I'd built there. But some doors, once opened, ask you to walk through them. The first board meeting I attended was on a Tuesday in October. I drove to the building I had not set foot in since I was a teenager, parked in the visitor lot because I didn't yet have an assigned space, and sat in my car for approximately 4 minutes before getting out. Not an hour this time. 4 minutes. I considered that progress. My stepbrother was in the conference room when I arrived. He was sitting at the far end of the table, and he looked, for the first time in my memory, genuinely uncertain. He had inherited his mother's instinct for the social landscape, the ability to sense which way the ground was tilting, and the ground had been tilting for weeks. He did not speak to me directly. I did not go out of my way to speak to him. There would be time to figure out how to exist in the same professional space. That day was not the day. My grandfather was there. He had made the 8-hour drive and was sitting near the head of the table in the same careful, unhurried way he always occupied a room. When I walked in, he looked up and something shifted in his face, not triumph, not vindication, something quieter than both of those, something that looked, more than anything, like relief. I took a seat. When the meeting was called to order, My name was read from the updated shareholder record. No one in the room made a sound. The building outside the windows was doing its ordinary Tuesday things. Trucks on the access road, a forklift moving in the yard, people getting work done. 40 years of that. My grandmother's hands in the walls. I thought about a version of me at 10 years old, sitting on the back porch steps in September, being told I was my mother's daughter. I thought about the shoebox of birthday cards I had moved from apartment to apartment for years without entirely understanding why. I thought about how long it takes to become the version of yourself that stops explaining things away. I opened my notebook. I was ready to start. There are things I want to say to anyone who might recognize themselves in this story, in the years before the folder and the parking lot and the Tuesday meeting. I want to say that the slow accumulation of small dismissals is a real thing that does real damage, and it does not require a dramatic villain or a single defining moment to be true. I want to say that the people who love you quietly and consistently, who mail cards to your campus address and ask about your classes and tell you to keep every single one of those cards somewhere safe, those people are doing something important, even when it doesn't look like much. Especially when it doesn't look like much. I want to say that there is a version of me who never opened that folder, who handed it back, or let it sit, or convinced herself it was too complicated, that the peace of staying small was worth more than the disruption of claiming what was hers. I was her for a long time, but I also want to say that the slow part is where you actually learn things. And sometimes, the thing you learn is that you were never actually small. You were just waiting to have proof that you already knew. My grandfather called me on a Thursday evening, about a month after the board meeting. He'd been having some health things, nothing critical, he was quick to say, but enough that he'd been seeing his doctor more regularly. His voice sounded a little tired, but warm the way it always was. He said, "How are you settling in?" I told him about a project I'd been working on, a process that had been running inefficiently for years that I thought I could fix. He asked me several specific, smart questions about it, the way he always had. At one point he laughed at something I said, and it was his real laugh, the one that didn't perform anything. At the end of the call, I said, "I found a photo of you and Grandma from when the company first opened. Someone had it framed in the hallway." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She would have liked you being there." I said, "I think I would have liked her." "You would have," he said. "She didn't have patience for nonsense either." I laughed. He laughed. And for a minute we were just two people on the phone who had both lost someone and found something else, and the night outside my window was the particular blue that October gets when the air is cold and the light is low and everything is in the process of becoming what it actually is. I told him I loved him. He said, "I know, sweetheart, I know you do. Some things are worth the wait. Not because waiting is noble, or because patience is a virtue that gets rewarded on some cosmic schedule, but because the version of you that exists on the other side of it, the one who has had time to build herself from scratch, who knows exactly what she's made of without anyone else's permission, that version is ready. She can hold it. She won't give it back." I drove into the parking lot the next morning and took the last available spot near the side door, the one I'd been using since I didn't have an assigned space yet. I made a note to talk to someone about that,